Okay, class, so we're going to keep moving through the remainder of the units for the semester. Because you have other assignments going on, I decided to keep most of these relatively short just so that you're not terribly overwhelmed. But just because they're short doesn't mean they don't give us something particularly interesting to talk about with each of the people that we read across the semester, right? So we're going to start off with Dulce Maria Loynaz, right? We used Absolute Solitude as our particular book in this for Unit 5, right? With our little intermediary time where we talk a little bit about Aristotle, but we'll come back to that. And that will have its own video as well. So I wanted us to take a little bit of time to talk about who Dulce Maria is, then a little bit about her work, and then, the next video will be the Poetics, and then we have Apollinaire, Rilke, and then finally the Kojiki for the end of the semester. So Dulce Maria, right? Super interesting figure historically. I'm not Cuban myself, but Cuban culture pops up a lot growing up in Miami. So I always found it interesting that she didn't pop up earlier in studies down there. In academia, right? So born in 1902. So what's interesting to note about this, being born in 1902 means she's born about 4 years after the War for Independence for Cuba, in which her father was a really famous war hero and wrote one of the famous kind of like war marches. And then she also had a brother who was a poet in life also. Born in Havana, right? Most of her publication actually all comes essentially pre what we call the Cuban Revolution, right, which is like 58-ish, right? So she grows up and comes to adulthood and kind of artistic maturity before the revolution and Castro and what we know as modern Cuba, right? Or at the very least, the politics of Cuba that the United States very vehemently did not enjoy, we'll say, right? So incredibly well-educated woman, right? Like 2 doctorates of law. Right around that time, so like 1935, where she's getting her second one, right? She publishes a novel, Jardin, right? Whatever. I think French. My bad, right? But the garden. Around that time, right on the cusp, and essentially in time with when women are given the ability to vote in Cuba, right? So the themes of the novel really intertwine with a lot of feminist ideals moving through Cuban culture at the time. And then in addition to that, you have a really interesting connection to that in terms of just kind of where feminism fit into the social space, the zeitgeist in Cuba at the time. Feminism was being talked about and discussed. It was important, right? Even in the kind of like day-to-day culture. So she was kind of like right embroiled in the cusp of that. So super incredibly awarded over her life. You can go to a Wikipedia page and look at the list of accolades. She has a lot of them. She doesn't have which is something we'll talk about after, but she doesn't have, for example, like a Nobel laureacy in poetry. She does have what Wikipedia describes without citation as the Spanish language equivalent, which sort of, right? But there are some complications to that, right? I think of her a lot in conversation with Neruda because of this, right? Straddling different sides of of revolution, of political engagement and activism, and then kind of how society treated them later in life, right? But she was very, very honored even while she was alive in terms of accolades. She gave lots of talks and performances. She traveled a whole lot. So like 18 to like 20 something, she was all over the place, all the way out to Egypt, farther east than that, all over North America, Canada, Europe. She went everywhere, right? Her family was afforded a lot of luxuries that only the wealthy could have, right? Um, so the revolution happens, 58, 59. It's kind of solidified, and she stops writing voluntarily, right? No more writing and publishing in Cuba, right? Um, and it's odd, right? The timing can't really be coincidental, right? It doesn't fit for it to be coincidental. She is a very smart and engaged person, right? So it didn't just kind of fall into place this way, right? But in a very distinct difference, I think, from someone like Neruda, right? She doesn't seem to feel the need to talk about why, right? She just stops, right? Very well known for being very kind of discreet and private and keeping to herself, right? Bear in mind, at the time in Cuba, she was known, but she wasn't like super famous in Cuba, right? Her bigger popularity comes actually out on the cusp of. She's more well known in like Spain and stuff like that at the time, which is interesting. But this goes down. She stops writing. Even her kind of close confidants and friends are just like, I don't know, like clearly has something to do with the revolution, right? But why? I think the fact that she stays in and around Cuba is also interesting in this because, traveling to conferences and everything is interesting because Miami, for example, becomes such a hub for what we would call poets in exile, right? Cubano poets who have come to the United States to Miami and are writing in and being politically involved and talking about the revolution and what came of it well into the 80s and 90s. But she's not doing that, right? She kind of just retreats from the artistic life. Now, I take some issue with the lack of citation on this, right? And I'm curious who says this and why they're an authority on it. But some of the sources do point out that some of the places you can just find general information about her suggest that some people think that, like, when the revolution happens, the Cuba that she grew up in and like kind of like fostered her when it went away with the revolution, so did her interest in writing. Her society vanished and she stopped writing, right? So interesting. I don't necessarily know if I agree if that's just kind of like a simplification of the reality. She made statements over her life, much more kind of pride in Cuba than pride in politics, right? So imagine if Neruda had been more in favor of Chile and less in favor of Stalin, right? Fascinating woman, okay? Didn't really get noticed that much in Cuba until she was well into her 80s, which is incredible on two fronts. She got to be alive for it, but also, she had been known in Spain and a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, but like Cuba didn't really celebrate her until she was in her 80s, right? And then she died in the late 90s, right? So she had a bit of time to enjoy success even in her own home country. She's interred in Cuba. She's got Cuban accolades. She has Spanish accolades, and so on and so forth, right? I thought a lot about whether or not she's really tied in with the same sort of political poetry that we think about when we think about Neruda and just like as a direct comparison, right? Like writing in around a communist revolution in a Latin American / Caribbean space. So she doesn't really get so much co-opted for that. She kind of steps out of the limelight, which is fascinating. Or even if it's not a co-opting by the situation around her, she doesn't allow herself to be part of it. But she is very venerated by the Spanish monarchy, which is its own set of issues that you should study up on, because she had such a mastery of what we think of as, quote, Spanish, right? Standard Spanish, Castilian Spanish, right? And is constantly kind of like recognized for that. She speaks colonialized Spanish, even within Spain, right? And writes in that space, right? Wealthy, European-type family. It makes sense, right? interesting woman, right? I find her very interesting. Which I've obviously said, there's some curious parts about her work that I want to talk a little bit about. My feelings on them kind of go back to an anecdote of how I first heard about her. I went to a wonderful poetry reading in South Beach, where a number of poets were reading their own work and the work of the people who inspired them. Right. It's a reading series that pops up every year for O Miami. It's delightful. Okay. We ran into the issue we ran into, and I went with a friend who's an incredibly celebrated poet who I will not name, but we are very close, and we were sitting listening, and this book was read from, right? A number of selections from Dulce Maria were read, and we were just captivated with it. This is gorgeous, right? It's very beautiful. It's lyric. It's demure and subdued, but still beautiful and encompassing, right? There's a very controlled, expert poetic hand at play in her work that I find incredibly gratifying to read. Like, reading her work immediately kind of strikes me as like, oh yes, this person is a master, right? For things that I haven't taken the time even to fully unpack why. It's just her work hits me right in the good spots, right? And then the wonderful woman who introduced Dulce Maria's work to us then read her book that she wrote in the style of Dulce Maria's poems, and it was a nightmare. So there's a couple reasons for that, right? The first, right, is that the first kind of asterisk that goes with that is that people who write a thing in the style of or in tribute to another poet, that's not necessarily a bad thing, or like, pull a line or riff on a line from someone else or an idea. Jericho Brown seems to not really enjoy it, but I plenty of poets do it. It pops up all the time, right? As kind of a hat tip of affection to what helped shape you, right? That being said, we run into a problem when we're trying to write in the style of something that doesn't fit the modern voice, right? It is also not necessarily being written in the style of the original thing. It's being written in the style of the translation of, which we talked a little bit about why that gets complicated, right? There is something of a disconnect between the original and the translated. Now, I do love that this book has both next to each other. I imagine, given that we live in the United States, a lot of you happen to speak some Spanish, right? Which is entirely a reasonable expectation in the United States in 2021 or for the past 20 years or so. So you can get a vibe for this, right? For the most part. And if you can't, entirely fine, right? But I wanted to have it there so that, if you can read at least some of the Spanish, you can get an idea for the sound of it, right? Romance language poetry, I think, is kind of doubly so wonderful to listen to, even over English poetry a lot of times, right? There is a lot more consideration just kind of built into the language in musicality in the words. I think the Romance languages lend themselves to that a lot better than the Germanic ones, right? That being said, right, there's a lot of interesting kind of shapes to things in here. You'll notice that they're not really titled so much as numbered. She did write for a lot of magazines like Neruda did. And this is a selected poems, meaning it's just a bunch taken out of a large body of her work that exists, right? There are moves in here, gesture, structural language concerns that don't, like, that if you wrote them into a poem today, you'd have to have a damn good reason to do it for people to not roll their eyes, right? She has these moments that are very fragmentary, like Sappho. Plenty of people still, mimic the fragmentary forms. But if we look at, for example, like 82, 83, with L, how my solitude becomes you, like it's this proclamation first line. It's like this is a little dramatic, right? a lot of current poetics, you're not going to see a lot of like, oh, muse, oh, the sunshine, right? Like that you get from the Romantics and the Victorians and trailing back through time. These big, grand, rhyming proclamations don't really happen. I mean, even if you look at Neruda's odes, he doesn't do that a lot, and it's the great adoration poem form, right? So, super, super specific in his time. It's definitely turn of the century, but when you look at this compared to Apollinaire, who we'll talk about a little in another video, they're not really that close to each other, right? Her still hits me in this feel of kind of grander, older voice that I guess makes sense, kind of coming from Money, right? Money is where kind of the old guard institutions just stick around for longer. So I just find it fascinating. I think part of that is why she might not show up as much, right? The other reality is there's a couple reasons I think that she doesn't show up as prominently, right? One, a lot of her work is smaller, and being in that particular series of voices has a more narrow audience appeal, right? Neruda covers all range of voices from big and oracular to kind of like small and a little bit silly, even just among the odes, right? Two, I think the fact that she's a woman is definitely part of it, right? And was probably something that impeded her in terms of society really propping her up and really propagating her, right? Especially in kind of like a very Catholic society, right? As via Spanish speaking world, right? Of course, she really pushed forward, and she does get the recognition that she wants, but it's still not quite as widespread, right? There's still kind of a level of patriarchal structure on the top of it, right? And I guess the last reason is that she stopped writing 60 years ago, right? Like, so 60 years ago, she stopped, right? Like, she stopped really putting out work. Now, what Dulce Maria's work looks like over the, remaining, 20, 30 years of her life, who's to say, right? Plenty of poets diminish, artists get worse, some get better, right? They kind of achieve that Zen-like opus at the top, right? But it is curious, and it is a consistent big question to me, right? That if Dulce Maria writes for the rest of her life out of Cuba, or just in general writes more for the rest of her life, what does her reputation look like, right? The translation here, I think, is not necessarily the most complicated part of this. Remember, we're using that Castilian standard Spanish, right? I think the interesting note for you to look at is to go do a little bit of minor background research on your own about Spain's own issues with kind of imperialism and the imposition of Castilian Spanish on the rest of the country, and then on the colonies and so on and so forth, right? You'll get into a lot of concerns with like the Basques and stuff like that. So she's writing in a version of Spanish that has been brought to a place and by colonial forces that that version of the language is in and of itself sort of like marred in all sorts of interesting and complex questions. So in the difficulty in translation, I think it would only kind of come down to if any of that is worthy of an asterisk. I think what makes her kind of very endearing to me is that a lot of what she does not necessitate one, right? Like she's using very standard Spanish. She writes in a very clear and purposeful voice, and she's not really tied up in that many other strings that might predispose someone to translate her work in a particular voice, right? These did not become, co-opted by the revolution, for example, all right? So curious, right? But I hope you enjoyed Dulce Maria. Dulce Maria's work. It's beautiful, right? She should be more read than she is, and I will see you all for the next short video on Aristotle's Poetics.